there's been some recent work done on emotions and higher order theories. Do you mind explaining what's going on there?
Sure. So what emotions are is obviously interesting topic, and there's a whole philosophy of emotions and a neuroscience of emotions, and there's a philosophy of consciousness and a neuroscience of consciousness, and you might think that they obviously go together, but they often don't obviously go together in terms of the work that people are doing. So that you find people working on these sort of in different areas, not talking to each other. Um, but so, for example, in the science of emotions, there's a debate which looks very much like a version of the higher order, first order debate between what are called constructivists about emotions and persons that think that there's kind of a basic set of emotions that we share with animals. So one kind of camp says that emotions are learned, um, and that we're not sort of born innately with emotional disposition or capacities, but rather we're born with a general system which allows us to construct emotional responses. So that sounds a bit like a higher order theory where you have certain physiological responses that can be interpreted in one way versus another way. So, you have classic empirical results where you give people a stimulant and they don't know it. So their heart rate increases and their breathing increases. And then you put one in a room with someone acting nervous and another one in a room with someone acting belligerent. And one person will report feeling nervous and the other one will report feeling angered or excited. And it sort of seems that what's happening is they both have the same physiological stimulant. So their heart is racing and their breathing is increased. But they're interpreting like, oh, I must be agitated because something is nervous in this room. Or I must be agitated because there's some reason to be angry. So you're telling yourself kind of a story about why your body is reacting this way. And that's sort of the emotion. Um, so in the science, neuroscience of emotions, there's a lot of people debating this. Um, in philosophy, we have the higher order theory of consciousness, what we've already been discussing, which sounds somewhat similar. It says you have these first order states, and then you have your interpretation of them. So when I was talking, I actually met Joe Ledoux because of a music event that I used to organize called the Qualia Fest, which was a lame attempt to get a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers together to play music, because it turns out that a lot of them do. And Joe has a band called the Amygdaloids, which they're still playing. The Amygdaloids are, they play what they call heavy mental music, and they write songs about fear and anxiety and so forth. And Ledoux is the guitar player and singer. So I play the drums and had a couple of groups or whatever. So I got these groups together to play at this event in New York. Not because anyone's any good, in my opinion, but just because it's hilarious to see neuroscientists and philosophers jamming together. So it was a free event. We never really charged money or anything like that to come out. But anyway, it's a lot of work to organize that stuff, it turns out. And then it got out of hand. The New York Times wrote an article about it, and I was like, oh man, this is not the kind of attention we want. Anyway, I got off topic. The point is, that's how I met Joe, was by finding out about his band and emailing him and saying, I'm a philosopher and I'm organizing this music event. And would your band come to this shitty dive bar and play with a bunch of philosophers? And he was like, yes, I will. And he showed up at the shitty dive bar full on ready to play, and did for four. We had four of those qualifiers. Anyway, so that's how I got to know him, not through philosophy or science, as it turns out, but hanging out in the bar talking about music and stuff. And, I didn't really know who he was in the sense of, he's a famous neuroscientist. So I'd heard his name. I knew he was well known. I didn't know like at what level he really was at that time. Anyway, so we started talking, and it turns out that we realized that there was this, like, there's two conversations going on at the same time that we're using similar lines of evidence, talking about, blind sight and this missing certain part of the brain, but still having the experience, like the same sorts of evidence, but not really connecting them together. So the first idea that we had was we want to get these two sides of the debate talking to each other, the neuroscientists who do emotion and the conscious researchers, the people that are talking about higher order and first order theories because they have something to say. And to sort of start the conversation, we wanted to offer a theory of the emotions in higher order terms. And that really, was Joe's idea. Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Never mind. Sorry. Get out of here, Siri. How do you turn Siri? There you go. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so he had some ideas that he wanted to develop, but he was, wanting to phrase them or put them in a way that other higher order theorists would recognize, so to speak. And to make a long story short, the basic idea that he had was that the states of which we're aware might themselves be in the prefrontal cortex, because there was at that time a common assumption that higher order theories were kind of committed to this simple division between the front of the brain being the higher order state and the back of the brain being the first order state, and this was aware of that. And Joe's idea was like, it might all be up here. There might be first order states in some areas of the prefrontal cortex, and there might be an awareness of those states in another area of the prefrontal cortex, so that the whole system, in a way, is at that level, anatomically, a higher order level. And that I think that his view is sort of that there's two systems that are joined together by causal links, but that like the amygdala first order system, that the lower order system can kind of be detached away from the higher order system. And his idea was that, so according to him and the view we developed, you don't get born experiencing fear, you get born detecting threats. So the amygdala is a threat detector and is in charge of what he calls a survival circuit, which is organizing a certain suite of behaviors which are engaged when you encounter a threat. And that can happen completely non-consciously without any experience of fear or anything like that. And over time, what you learn is that certain things are threatening to you and certain things are dangerous and certain situations are, ones that get you to think about being in danger. That's anxiety. So according to him, fear involves a threat currently in front of you, and anxiety involves thinking about a future threat or one that's in the past. So you're learning which things are threatening and which things are dangerous. And you come then to, over time, not only represent that there's a snake there, but that the snake is dangerous to you, that you have been threatened by the snake in the past. And once you get to that point, you experience fear, according to Ledoux. So the fear experience involves this explicit higher order awareness of you being in the presence of danger. So it's not just the detection of a threat. It's not even the guidance of behavior directed at avoiding the threat. It's this explicit recognition that it's you who's in danger, rather than just that there's danger out there. It's me. I'm in danger. That's fear, as he would put it in slogan form: no self, no fear. So he thinks that you've got to represent that as you in the danger, importantly. And those higher representations, he thinks, could be found in the prefrontal cortex, like maybe in the frontal pole, maybe in a network involving, there's different hypotheses you could have. But the idea that kind of connects this to the higher theory is that rather than thinking there's two systems, one for my experience of red and one for my experience of fear, there's one system, which just deals with experience generally. Experience of red, experience of fear are just different ways that the higher order state can represent what's going on at the lower level. And so one of the analogies that he often uses is that like the emotions are like a soup, right? There's no such thing as a chicken soup ingredient. There are things which you can use to make chicken soup, but it would be wrong to think of as celery as intrinsically wanting to be chicken soup or to be something else. So same with fear. There's no thing which counts as fear, but rather it's what unites all elements of fear is that there's something that you think is presenting a threat to you currently. And so we think you could have that without the amygdala. And there's a case of a woman with bilateral lesions to the amygdala. She was hailed as the woman without fear. And then there was a case where she could experience fear, though. And there's this interview with her where she even says that when they asphyxiated her, so they put her in a condition where she couldn't breathe, and then she started having this fear response to asphyxiation. And even though her amygdala was gone, what she says afterwards is that she didn't think there's anything wrong with her fear experience, that it felt like fear. And so that's, what we think is part of the evidence that you could have fear experience without the amygdala, because the amygdala will offer some content to the higher order state that colors or flavors the fear in a certain way by tweaking the content of the higher order state, if this theory is right. But it itself is not the feeling of fear. The amygdala's activity is a non-conscious threat detector, which then activates this higher order representation of me being in a threat situation. And that could be activated in different ways, as it was in this woman. It wasn't activated by the amygdala. She didn't have one. It was activated by something else. It could be activated by, your fear of being dead. So you might think about, gee, I'm going to die someday, and suddenly you have this like panic attack or something. And that would be, higher state being activated, not by the amygdala detecting a threat, but by your abstract conceptualization of the end of your existence triggering this higher representation. So that would be the idea, is that it allows you to explain all of these different kind of experiences with one single system. And that the difference between like seeing red and feeling fear is exactly the difference between representing yourself as seeing red versus representing yourself as being afraid of.
Wow. All that from that gig.
Yeah. All that from yeah, exactly. Yes, all that from that gig, yeah.
So continuing with that, from a higher order perspective, what do you think of the idea of well-being, the psychological idea of well-being?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to take into consideration the person when you're thinking about psychology or psychiatry. So I think that, like, for example, a lot of CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, is aimed at the behavior of the person and maybe the way the person thinks subpersonally or something like that. But they're not really aimed at the experience of the person or what it's like to be the person. In fact, those things are not what you're taking into consideration. You're taking into consideration, like, how can I do something else, get them to reconceptualize what's going on, or expose them to something, or, whatever the case may be. But you're not really worried about maybe in some abstract sense, you're worried about their well-being because you're trying to make them better. But really what you're doing is adjusting their behavior. And the same is true with psychopharmacology. So if you take Paxil or Prozac, then, by the way, there's a whole big drama about that recently, which, serotonin is being currently reevaluated. And it's not really clear that we have as much evidence as we thought we did that this correlation exists between states of mood and states of serotonin. Anyway, but there's been a big longitudinal study that recently came out, which suggests it's not as clear as maybe we thought it was. Anyway, so what was it I saying? Oh, yeah, right. So suppose that you're very depressed. Your mood is, depressed. You don't want to go to work. You're not interested in the same things that you used to be. You don't care about philosophy anymore. You're not reading your books or going to the after work functions or whatever the case may be. So you're depressed, and suppose that this lasts for a period of time so that it becomes clinically significant, not just a passing thing over the weekend, but now it's months and months. Great. So then you go and maybe get some help, and they diagnose you with depression. And then they say, well, okay, here's some medication, start taking it. And then you got to go to therapy as well. Great. So the medication, we know, is correlated with a change in behavior. So if you take the medication, then chances are you'll go back to work. and go back to school and complete the after school assignments or whatever. But no one ever says like, I'm cured. I feel like myself again. I feel so much better. Like, gee, what a relief. So that has not occurred. We don't have a cure for depression. What we have is something that alters behavior of depressed persons. And that's good, to some degree or other. They don't lose their jobs. They can carry on socially, but they don't feel good. And you can ask anyone who's I've never taken Prozac or Paxil, but I've talked to tons of people who have. And I've never heard anyone say, it changed my life for the better. I felt great. I felt like my old self again. They say, no, I felt weird, or like not like myself actually. But I was still, able to go to work. And that's because that's what the drug does. And that's because when we study what the drug does, we test it on rats. So what you do is you shock a rat a bunch of times so that it becomes averse to the environment. And then you give it this drug, and lo and behold, it goes back into that room where the shock happens. So you change the rat's behavior. But did you make the rat feel better? I don't know. What does that mean? How can we test that? We have no clue. And in fact, no one ever talks about that in the animal literature on this stuff. No one says the rat feels better. What they say is its behavior change. It doesn't, it may not be afraid or feel anxiety, but those are code words for its behavior is such and such and blah and blah. So in that sense, I think well-being is sorely missing from a lot of what we think of as therapeutic medicine, because the subject, the person themselves, their state of mind, their experience, their conscious experience is not really part of the equation. You've got to go to therapy, and they talk about how do you feel maybe in therapy. And it makes you feel better. Talking to someone is good. Talking to a therapist is even better. It does have some effect. It has about the same effect as taking the Paxil, actually. So why does we have this mismatch? Talking to people, focusing on well-being in that way, the psychological well-being of the person is effective, but not all by itself very effective. Giving the person a certain kind of drug is effective, but not by itself all very effective. So it kind of looks like the evidence suggests that you got to have an interplay between the two, because maybe there's two systems here actually. Maybe giving the drugs is affecting the first order system, which is changing the behavior, but not changing the experience. So that's why the experience remains kind of the same, like, not great, but the behavior's changed. So the cause and effect drags one to the other. So you stop taking the drugs and you don't get the great effects anymore. Whereas on the other hand, the talk therapy may be adjusting the way you're conceptualizing the situation, the way you think about things. So your higher order states, in other words, the way you're conceptualizing it. And that may change your experience, but not the behavior, because that's being produced by the first order state. So it's at least, this is part of the argument that Joe and I were trying to develop in this. And this really is more, he was the driving force behind this argument, but I agree with him and try to help him say it. Is that this might be because we're thinking there's one system here that does consciousness and behavior. But maybe there's not. Maybe there's two systems, one for behavior, one for consciousness. Maybe, and that's sort of what the higher order theory predicts, is that there's going to be two systems. One that's partly involved in the first order states which drive the behavior, and one that's partly involved in the inner awareness that is the conscious experience. And you got to focus on both of them. So, and this is the dirty secret of the pharmacology sciences, that there's no new drugs for 50 years. We're still giving people Thorazine. Thorazine was discovered in the 50s. So, great. We can say what Thorazine does on serotonin and blah, blah, blah. We can say what Paxil does to serotonin and blah, blah, blah. But we haven't, on the basis of all of our new technology and knowledge of the brain, invented some new drug which worked better than these ones that we discovered kind of by chance. So that's somewhat depressing, and has actually caused a lot of companies to pull funding out of research in this area, because they're just not finding. When you compare what's happened with antibiotics, like in my lifetime, when I was little, they just gave you like amoxicillin, penicillin. Now we're like on third generation drugs that like or have names that I don't even recognize, and they're not Cillins anymore. They're not based on mold. No, we discover something else about how to kill these things. So yeah, we can go back to that stuff if we need to, but we have this whole other class of drugs that work in a different way based on our further understanding of what's going on, and we haven't achieved that in the psychopharmacology. And maybe our suggestion is that's because we're focusing not on the experience of the person, because that's kind of a dirty word, and we want to be, cognitive behavioral. Okay, but where's the experience? Where's the well-being of the person? What it's like to be them? So actually, I think that it's important that that does show up in there as part of our full understanding. I think some phenomenology is important. You got to have both ends of it. You got to know what it's like, and you got to know how the brain works, and got to connect them. And anytime you try to ignore one or the other, you're going to end up with a problem. So, I mean, as far as the science of well-being and like what contributes to it, I didn't really talk about that. But I do think that understanding the experience of the person, like explicitly putting that up front and saying the goal of therapy should be changing what it's like for you, changing your experience of the world. That it should make you feel better. And that doesn't seem to be the explicit goal of a lot of this research. So that in some some people find that quite shocking to say the experience of the person. That's very vague and subjective. Yeah, but you got to deal with what you're dealing with. So anyway, so that would be I do think it's important for those reasons.